We often like to celebrate special occasions with a special meal, don't we? Whether it's your birthday party with a yummy cake and ice cream, or perhaps a special dinner to celebrate a wedding anniversary, for example. We often use meals to mark special occasions. Well, every year Jesus would have eaten one particular special meal, called the Passover. It commemorated the time many years before when God's people were kept safe during a night of terrible judgment on the nation of Egypt. They were told to share a meal of roast lamb and bread made without yeast, and they were told to take some of the lamb's blood and paint it around the door frames of their houses. God had told them that if they sheltered under that sign of blood that had been shed, then he promised he would save them. And from then on, they shared a special meal every year to remind them of his great saving act on their behalf. The Bible records how Jesus celebrates one such Passover meal with his friends the evening before he dies. But on this occasion there is something extra. As the usual meal comes to a close, Jesus takes the familiar symbols of bread and wine and makes some amazing statements. Listen to what he says. And Jesus took bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you." You know, Jesus often used symbolic language to make his teaching come alive. He had previously described himself as the bread of life, someone who would satisfy their spiritual hunger forever. And he talked about himself as the true vine, with his followers described as branches, spliced, as it were, into him, the life-giving main plant. But this is something even more arresting. Jesus now uses symbolic language to explain how he will sacrifice himself for us, how he will freely give his life for us. Because the very next day his body was to be broken for us, and his blood was to be poured out for us on a cross of execution. And did you notice how this would mean the end of all the old sacrifices and memorials? Jesus said his blood poured out will mark a new covenant. What does that mean? A covenant is an agreement or a promise made between two parties or two people. And the promise that Jesus now offers is not between God and one nation, but for all who trust in him, regardless of race or nationality. The Passover meal reminded them of the night that God saved his people from Egypt. And now Jesus inaugurates a new meal of remembrance with a new promise, a new covenant, which gloriously surpasses and replaces what had gone before. The Passover was a shadow of what was to come. It pointed forward to God's great plan of salvation for all who believe, the death of Jesus Christ on the cross. And the Lord's Supper points back to that same cross, when Christian believers, taking the symbols of bread and wine, can recall the words of one of the disciples who was at that very first meal and who later wrote, "This is love, not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son as an atoning sacrifice for our sins." Well, will you be remembering and giving thanks for God's sacrificial love this Easter?